A home that no longer feels like home. The late afternoon sun hung low over Baton Rouge, Louisiana, painting the cracked sidewalks in hues of orange and gold. A warm breeze rustled through the live oaks lining the streets, carrying with it the scent of fried catfish, gasoline, and something else. Something that smelled like old memories. Lieutenant Imani Carter walked with purpose, her steps measured, her posture unshaken. Though she wore no uniform, the way she moved, alert, disciplined, gave her away. A warrior's stance, her father used to call it. It had been 7 years since she last set foot in this neighborhood. 7 years since she buried her mother, since she walked away from the streets that had raised her, choosing instead the life of a soldier. She'd spent years in places most Americans only saw in news reports: Kandahar, Ramadi, Mogadishu. She had led teams through hostile terrain, survived enemy ambushes, and fought battles in the dead of night. And yet, standing here, on the pavement where she'd once played jump rope as a kid, she felt like a stranger. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, her dark brown eyes sweeping over the familiar yet foreign scene. The same convenience store at the corner, still advertising 2-for-1 sodas in a sun-bleached sign. The same barbershop with its broken neon open sign flickering against the dusk. The same basketball court where kids dribbled and shouted, playing with the same intensity she remembered from her childhood. A wave of nostalgia hit her like an unexpected tide. The laughter, the voices, the smells of fried food wafting from Miss Lovern's restaurant down the street. It all came back in a rush. She hadn't come here for memories, though. She came because it was time. Time to lay down roots. Time to figure out what home meant now that she was no longer a soldier. But even as she walked, a quiet tension lingered in her gut. It was the kind of awareness that came with experience, with knowing when you were being watched. She felt the eyes before she saw them. A group of teenage boys, huddled outside a corner store, their laughter quieting as she passed. One of them, maybe 16, did a quick double take before nodding respectfully. "You military?" he asked. Imani stopped, turning slightly to meet his gaze. The way he asked, the quiet curiosity, told her he had someone close who served. "Something like that," she replied. The boy grinned, his eyes lighting up. "Figured. My cousin's in the army. He walks like you." Before she could respond, one of his friends called him inside. Just like that, he was gone. She exhaled slowly, continuing down the street. Moments like that reminded her why she fought, why she endured. But the moment didn't last. The sound of a slow-moving patrol car caught her attention. It wasn't the usual high-speed pass of an officer uninterested in the neighborhood. No, this was different. The car crawled along the curb, keeping pace with her steps. She knew what was coming before it happened. The window rolled down. A voice, deep and gravelly, cut through the warm evening air. "Excuse me, miss." Imani stopped, turning slightly. The officer inside was exactly the type she had learned to recognize early. White, mid-40s, crew cut. His uniform was pressed, his arms thick, his mirrored sunglasses shielding his eyes. But she didn't need to see them to know how he was looking at her. He was assessing her, scanning her like she was out of place. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge of authority that said he expected to be obeyed. Imani met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She dealt with men like him before. Men who saw a confident black woman and mistook it for a challenge. She shifted the strap of her duffel bag. "Just walking." "Where to?" She arched a brow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk in my own neighborhood." The smirk on his lips faded, just a little. "We've had some break-ins around here," he said. "Just making sure everything's in order." Imani held his gaze, unfazed. "You see me breaking into something." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned further against the open window, exhaling sharply. "Just doing my job." Imani exhaled through her nose, suppressing the urge to shake her head. "Well, I'm just walking." She could feel the shift happening. The way his posture tensed just slightly, the way his smirk had disappeared completely. He wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for control. And something about her, not just her presence, but the way she refused to shrink, wasn't sitting right with him. She had two choices: keep engaging or walk away. Before she could decide, he put the car in park. "Hold on a second," he said, stepping out. "Let's see some ID." Imani didn't move. She'd been trained to assess threats, surroundings, exits. Right now, she wasn't just assessing a man in uniform. She was assessing a man who was getting too comfortable pushing his authority. And she already knew one thing: this wasn't over. The thin line between power and prejudice. Imani took a deep breath, steadying herself as she kept her gaze locked on the officer. His request for her ID wasn't a request at all. It was a demand wrapped in false politeness. He had already decided something about her, something that required him to pull her out of the flow of normal life and place her under his scrutiny. She had seen this game before, played too many times, and she knew exactly how it went. The street around them remained lively, but a subtle shift was occurring. People were beginning to slow down, their conversations lowering into murmurs, their curious glances turning into cautious stares. They had seen scenes like this before, where an officer's attention on a person like her rarely ended in a simple, peaceful resolution. Some looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. Others remained, their silent presence a testament to how routine moments like these had become. She reached into the pocket of her cargo pants slowly, making sure every movement was deliberate. In a world where assumptions could be deadly, she wasn't about to make a move that could be misinterpreted. Pulling out her military ID, she held it up between her fingers. She didn't hand it to him. That wasn't a requirement. The law didn't demand she surrender it, only that she provide identification when asked. The officer, whose name read Simmons, squinted at the card, but made no effort to take it from her hands. Instead, his lips curled slightly in something that wasn't quite amusement. It was the look of a man who had spent years in a position of unchecked authority, a man who thrived on the imbalance of power he held over others. "Military, huh?" he muttered, dragging out the words as if they were some kind of joke. Imani didn't respond. She had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. Simmons tilted his head, staring at her ID before flicking his gaze back to her face. "You expect me to believe you're military?" His voice carried that smug disbelief that she had heard 100 times before, usually from men who struggled to accept that a black woman could be anything other than what they assumed. She still didn't react. She let his words hang in the air, unchallenged, because she knew the truth. She had faced men more dangerous than him. She had fought enemies who didn't speak her language, didn't recognize her humanity, and didn't care whether she lived or died. This man, standing before her in a crisp uniform and badge, was nowhere near her biggest challenge. When she refused to take the bait, Simmons clicked his tongue and reached out, snatching the ID from her fingers without permission. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her posture relaxed, her hands at her sides. That was the mistake he wanted her to make, flinching, reacting, giving him an excuse to escalate. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "Navy SEALs," Simmons read aloud, his lips twitching with poorly hidden skepticism. "That's cute." There it was, the insult hidden beneath condescension. She had faced it in training, in deployment, in rooms filled with men who assumed she didn't belong. They saw her as a novelty at best, a threat at worst. "Return it," she said, her voice calm but firm. Simmons turned the card over between his fingers as if inspecting it for flaws. "Where exactly do you serve?" She gave him a slow, unimpressed blink. "I don't answer unnecessary questions." His smirk faltered for the briefest moment before returning. "That's so." His fingers twitched, and then suddenly, without warning, he folded the ID slightly between his fingers, bending the corner. It wasn't enough to damage it, but it was deliberate. A move meant to remind her that he had her identification in his possession, that he could do whatever he wanted with it. A muscle in her jaw flexed. "Return it." But instead of handing it back, he let out a low chuckle. "You know, I've been on the force for 20 years. Seen all kinds of people come through this neighborhood." He paused, his tone shifting into something darker. "Never met a woman Navy SEAL before. You sure this isn't a fake?" The blatant disrespect was almost laughable. Almost. But Imani had learned long ago that there was nothing funny about moments like these. This wasn't just about him doubting her credentials. It was about him doubting her right to exist in this space without his permission. "You can run it through your system," she said flatly. "You'll find out soon enough." But that wasn't what Simmons wanted. He wasn't interested in confirming the truth. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to remind her of the power he had. She could see the frustration growing in his eyes. She wasn't playing along the way he expected. That was when she noticed the shift in the street. The people watching weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. A young woman standing a few feet away had pulled out her phone, her camera clearly recording. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. Simmons noticed. The smugness in his expression wavered just slightly. A man across the street, arms folded over his chest, shook his head in disapproval. Another couple near a food truck had stopped eating, their gazes locked onto the unfolding scene. The power dynamic had changed, and Simmons knew it. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightening as he realized he was now being scrutinized in the same way he had scrutinized her. He flicked his gaze back to her, nostrils flaring slightly. "I don't appreciate people trying to make a show out of me doing my job," he muttered. "Then stop putting on a show." Imani shot back, her tone unwavering. A flicker of something dark passed through his expression. A challenge. Then, just like that, he made his next move. He stepped forward, just a single inch. But it was enough. It was a deliberate attempt to invade her space, to establish his dominance. "I don't know who you think you are," Simmons said, his voice dropping lower. "But out here, I make the calls." Imani let a small, knowing smirk play at the edge of her lips, just enough to let him know he was making a mistake. "You sure about that?" His hand twitched, his grip on her ID tightened, and then he reached for her wrist. Bad move. Her training kicked in before she even had to think. With a smooth, precise motion, she shifted her weight, moving her arm just enough to evade his grasp. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't hostile. It was controlled. A simple redirection. Simmons stumbled slightly, his balance thrown off for half a second. Half a second was all it took. The people watching reacted instantly. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The woman recording zoomed in. Someone across the street let out a low whistle. The tension in the air was thick now. It was no longer just an officer doing his job. It was a man desperately trying to regain power he had already lost. Simmons' breath hitched slightly. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "That's assault," he hissed. "No," Imani said coolly. "That's called avoiding unnecessary contact." His face darkened. "You think this is a joke?" She tilted her head slightly. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" His anger was reaching a boiling point. She could see it in the way his nostrils flared, the way his chest rose and fell faster than before. And then his hand moved toward his belt, toward his cuffs. "I need backup," Simmons said into his radio, his voice clipped. "Uncooperative suspect." A scoff came from the crowd. Someone muttered, "This is some bull," before catching themselves. The woman recording spoke up, her voice sharp. "Uncooperative. You're the only one getting loud." Imani could feel it now. The moment was spiraling. Simmons had made up his mind. He wasn't going to back down, not with so many eyes on him. And she wasn't going to let this escalate any further. She had one more move to make. And Simmons, he wasn't going to like it. The breaking point. A charged silence hung in the thick Louisiana air. The entire block seemed to be holding its breath, the warm evening breeze doing little to dissipate the tension radiating between Imani and Officer Simmons. The flashing lights of his patrol car painted the nearby buildings in red and blue hues, an unspoken warning. Imani stood her ground, her body calm and composed, but her mind sharp as a blade. She had been in countless situations like this before, not in this exact setting, but in places where power was a fragile illusion, where men who thought themselves invincible quickly learned that dominance was not the same as control. The only difference now was that the battlefield was her own neighborhood, the opponent not a foreign enemy, but a man who wore a badge and carried an unchecked sense of entitlement. The watching crowd had grown. What had started as a few curious glances had evolved into a full audience. More phones were out now, recording every moment. People whispered to each other in hushed tones, their expressions ranging from disbelief to barely contained anger. Everyone knew what was happening. They had seen it before. But something about this moment felt different. It was as if the crowd, normally resigned to watching these encounters in the same way, sensed that the rules were about to change. Simmons' breathing had grown heavier, his stance shifting from one of authority to something else, something more desperate. He wasn't just trying to assert control anymore. He was fighting to regain something that had already slipped through his fingers. His fingers hovered dangerously close to the cuffs on his belt, his pride dictating his next move, rather than logic or professionalism. "Turn around," Simmons ordered, his voice harder now, his patience fraying. "Hands behind your back." Imani didn't move. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't attacking. She was simply standing. And somehow, that alone was enough to make a man like Simmons unravel. "For what?" she asked, her tone even, unwavering. "For being uncooperative," he snapped. His voice had lost its earlier smugness. Now it was strained, raw with frustration. He was losing control, and he knew it. A man in the crowd let out a dry laugh. "Uncooperative? Man, you the only one trippin' right now." The woman recording zoomed in, shaking her head. "This ain't it, officer." Simmons' lips curled into a sneer. He wasn't looking at them anymore. He was locked in on Imani. She was the threat. She was the one who had refused to shrink, who had stood tall when he expected her to fold. His hand closed around his cuffs. And then he moved. Big mistake. The moment Simmons lunged, Imani's body reacted before her mind had to. Years of training, of combat experience, of muscle memory kicked in. She sidestepped, swift and seamless, pivoting just enough to avoid his grip. With the precision of someone who had spent her entire life in high-pressure situations, she reached out and redirected his momentum, a subtle but effective maneuver. Before Simmons could even register what had happened, his own force had sent him stumbling forward, his balance momentarily lost. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whistled. A group of teenagers near the food truck burst into laughter. "Oh, she played you, man. Damn, she moved like she in the Matrix or something." Simmons' face turned a deep, furious red. His breath came fast and uneven. And for a moment, he just stood there, fists clenched, his entire body radiating pure humiliation. He hadn't been struck. He hadn't been attacked. And yet, in the eyes of the crowd, he had just lost. The woman with the phone smirked. "Oh yeah, I got every second of that." Imani remained where she was, her stance relaxed, her hands still at her sides. She had done nothing more than evade an unwarranted assault, but the damage was done. Simmons' authority had taken a hit in front of an audience, and that was worse than any physical attack. For a moment, it seemed like he might try again, his fingers twitching with unspent anger. But then the sound of another engine approaching made him freeze. A second patrol car rolled to a stop behind Simmons' vehicle. Sergeant William Burke stepped out. Unlike Simmons, Burke was older, seasoned, and carried himself with the weariness of a man who had seen too much in his career. His sharp blue eyes scanned the scene, taking in everything. The phones recording, the gathered crowd, Simmons' red face, and Imani standing calmly in front of him. "What the hell is going on here?" Burke's voice was heavy with authority, but it lacked the aggression that Simmons had. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for an answer. Simmons stiffened, still struggling to compose himself. She resisted. He spat out. Wouldn't comply. A collective murmur rolled through the crowd. Someone scoffed. Man, you lying, and you know it. The woman recording took a step closer. You want to see the footage, Sergeant? 'Cause I got it all. Burke exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. He didn't even need to see the footage. He had been in this job long enough to read between the lines. He looked at Imani. That true? She met his gaze without hesitation. He stopped me for no reason, asked for ID, and I gave it to him. He didn't like my credentials, so he tried to escalate. She kept her voice even, controlled. I never touched him, but when he reached for me, I avoided contact. Burke was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the situation. He turned his gaze back to Simmons, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he extended his hand. Give me the ID. Simmons hesitated, his fingers tightening around it like a child refusing to surrender a stolen toy. But under Burke's steady, unyielding stare, he had no choice. He slapped the card into Burke's palm. Burke flipped it over, reading the name. Then his eyes widened slightly, and his expression shifted, not just to recognition, but to realization. His gaze flickered between Imani and the name on the card, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Lieutenant Carter. Simmons' entire body stiffened. His breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. The murmurs in the crowd turned into outright whispers. Burke exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He turned to Simmons. You knew she was a Navy SEAL. Simmons' face paled. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Burke's lips pressed into a tight line. You've been on the force 20 years, Simmons, and yet you thought it was a good idea to harass a highly trained military officer. His voice was dangerously low now, in front of half the damn neighborhood. Simmons looked as if he wanted to disappear. Burke straightened, turning back to Imani. Do you wish to press charges? The question hung in the air. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Simmons swallowed hard. His breathing was uneven now, his entire career flashing before his eyes. Imani didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, let Simmons feel every ounce of the weight pressing down on him. Finally, she exhaled. No. A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. Even Burke raised an eyebrow. You sure? He asked. She nodded. I didn't come home looking for a fight. Her voice was quiet but firm. I just wanted to walk in my own neighborhood. Burke studied her for a long moment, then sighed. He turned back to Simmons. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Gasps, murmurs, a shifting in the air. Simmons' face drained of color. You can't be serious. I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse, Burke said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Simmons' fists clenched at his sides. His humiliation was now public record, his authority shattered. Imani held his gaze one last time. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She had already won. And Simmons, he knew it too. The weight of consequence. The sound of Simmons' heavy breathing was audible even over the murmurs of the gathered crowd. His chest rose and fell in quick, uneven bursts, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles had turned ghostly white. He was trying, failing, to process what had just happened. His entire career, his entire sense of self, had been upended in a matter of minutes, not by an act of aggression, not by force, but by something much worse. He had lost control. And worse than that, he had lost it in front of everyone. Sergeant Burke, his face unreadable, adjusted his belt and exhaled deeply, as though the weight of this moment had landed squarely on his back. He had seen officers make bad calls before, had witnessed pride and prejudice turn into problems. But this was different. This was a man who had pushed his authority too far and had been caught in the act, not just by a handful of bystanders, but but by an entire community armed with cameras, recording every second of his failure. Burke turned his gaze back to Imani, his expression unreadable but measured. "Lieutenant Carter," he said carefully, as if saying her title aloud might remind everyone, Simmons included, exactly who she was. "You're absolutely sure you don't want to press charges?" Imani held his gaze, her face calm, her posture as steady as it had been from the start. "I'm sure," she said, her voice smooth, unwavering. "This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. And he's already felt it." Simmons scoffed, shaking his head in bitter disbelief, but even as he did, he refused to meet her eyes. He knew she was right. The weight of the phone still recording, the collective judgment from the people around him, it was crushing him. Burke studied her for a long moment before nodding. Understood. Then, with a slow inhale, he turned to Simmons. "Officer Simmons, I'll say it again. You're relieved of duty. Effective immediately." The finality of those words seemed to crash into Simmons like a wrecking ball. His jaw tightened, his breath coming out in ragged bursts. "You're really doing this?" His voice was hoarse, raw with disbelief. "Because she made a scene." Burke's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "No," he said, voice clipped, irritated, tired. "Because you made a scene. Because you escalated a situation that didn't need escalation. Because you let your ego dictate your actions instead of your training. And because this entire damn street has footage of you trying to intimidate a woman who has done more for this country than you ever will." The words hit hard. Simmons' face twisted, his mouth parting as if he wanted to argue, to protest, to claw back some piece of his authority, but there was nothing left to grab onto. The silence that followed was thick with finality. The woman with the phone smirked, lowering the camera slightly. "Oh yeah, that's gonna go viral." Simmons' head snapped in her direction, rage flashing across his face, but he said nothing. He couldn't. There was no saving himself from this, no twisting the story to favor him, no writing up a falsified report that would make Imani the aggressor. Not this time. Burke stepped closer to Simmons, lowering his voice, but still loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I suggest you go home, Officer Simmons, and I strongly suggest you think about how you got here." For a moment, Simmons just stood there, his body stiff as stone, his breathing uneven. His fingers twitched, curling and uncurling into fists at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward his squad car. The street watched in silence as he pulled open the door, his movements jerky, angry, humiliated. He slid inside, slammed the door shut, and peeled away from the curb so fast that his tires screeched against the pavement. As soon as he was gone, the crowd exhaled collectively, as if the weight of his presence had been suffocating them all. Conversations resumed, murmurs of disbelief mixing with quiet satisfaction. Some people lingered, their gazes flickering between Imani and Burke, waiting to see what would happen next. Burke let out a long breath, pinching the bridge of his nose before turning back to Imani. His expression softened, his gaze filled with something that resembled regret. "Lieutenant, He paused, reconsidering his words. "I wish this had gone differently." Imani tilted her head slightly. "So do I." Another pause. The heavy one. Then Burke sighed. "I'll make sure the footage gets logged properly. Simmons won't be back in uniform anytime soon." Imani nodded. That was all she needed to hear. The woman with the phone stepped closer, her brows raised. "So, what now?" Imani took a deep breath. "Now, I go home." The woman smirked. "Guess we'll see you on the news tonight." Imani let out a small huff of amusement but said nothing. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, turned, and walked away. She didn't need to look back to know that the crowd was still watching her. She didn't need to turn around to know that today was something people wouldn't forget. As she moved further down the street, the sounds of the city washed over her, the distant honking of cars, the chatter of people outside the corner store, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball against asphalt. It was strange how little had changed since she had left. And yet, at the same time, everything felt different. She had spent years fighting battles in foreign countries, defending people who barely knew her name. But today, she had fought a battle on her own streets, for herself, for her right to exist without question, without scrutiny, without being made to feel like she didn't belong. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were no medals, no commendations. There wouldn't be a parade or a ceremony. But it was a victory nonetheless. She walked on, her step steady, her posture unshaken. No matter where she went, no matter what came next, she would never shrink. Echoes of a battle won. The evening air settled thick and humid around Imani as she walked away from the scene. The scent of fried catfish and old pavement mixed with the distant hum of street traffic, grounding her in the reality that despite what had just happened, life in the neighborhood moved on. Conversations resumed, the basketball game down the block picked up again, and Miss Levern's restaurant kept pushing out orders like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Imani could feel it in the way people watched her now, not with fear or suspicion, but with something different, a quiet respect, a recognition. She had stood her ground against a man who wielded power as a weapon, and she hadn't just walked away, she had won. Not in the traditional sense, not in the way she had been trained to measure victory on the battlefield, where success was defined by strategy, precision, and execution. No, this was a different kind of battle. A war that wasn't fought with bullets but with perception, with resistance, with the refusal to be placed in a box. She had spent her entire life preparing for moments of confrontation. The military had drilled discipline into her, taught her how to read threats, how to anticipate attacks, how to control her breathing under pressure. But they hadn't prepared her for this, the constant, exhausting need to prove herself even after she had earned her place. Imani inhaled slowly through her nose, her fingers tightening around the strap of her duffel bag. The weight of it was familiar, comforting even. It reminded her that she was still the same woman who had led teams through hell and back, the same woman who had been trained to operate in the dead of night under enemy fire. Yet here, in the place she once called home, she had been reduced to something less in the eyes of a man who saw her presence as a problem before he even knew her name. She hadn't thought she would have to fight here. But wasn't that always the case? The thought sat heavy in her chest as she made her way down the block, past old memories that felt distant yet close enough to touch. She caught glimpses of familiarity. The weathered stoop where she had once scraped her knees as a child, the rusted chain-link fence she had climbed one too many times to retrieve a ball. These streets had shaped her long before she ever held a gun or took orders from a commanding officer. It wasn't long before she reached the steps of a house she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Her father's house. The porch creaked under her weight as she climbed the short set of stairs, a rush of nostalgia hitting her as she took in the chipped paint and the wind chime that still hung from the awning, swaying gently in the evening breeze. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the old brass doorknob before finally turning it. The door swung open with a familiar groan, and the scent of old wood, leather, and a faint trace of her father's aftershave greeted her. The house was still as she had left it, as if time had stood still in her absence. She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her, her eyes scanning the walls adorned with framed photographs, some of her father in uniform, others of her mother, and a handful of herself as a child. The living room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the kitchen where the glow of an old lamp flickered against the walls. Then, from the back of the house, came a voice. "You always sit like that when you're thinking." She turned, already knowing who it was. Uncle Ray. His frame was as solid as ever, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he leaned against it, arms crossed over his chest. His salt and pepper beard had grown fuller since she last saw him, but his sharp eyes hadn't dulled one bit. She offered a small, tired smile. "And you always have a way of sneaking up on me." Ray chuckled, stepping forward. "Ain't sneakin' when you leave the door wide open." He studied her for a moment before nodding toward the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. You planning on staying for a while, or is this just a pit stop? Imani exhaled, setting the bag down by the couch. Not sure yet. Ray made a sound of acknowledgement but didn't press further. He knew her well enough to know she wouldn't give an answer before she was ready. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen, grabbing 2 bottles of iced tea from the fridge before handing one to her. You made the news, he said, popping the cap off his bottle with ease. Imani sighed, tilting her head back slightly. Figures. Ray took a slow sip, watching her over the rim of his bottle. You could have pressed charges, you know. Would have been justified. She nodded, rolling the cool bottle between her palms. I know. He studied her, waiting. So why didn't you? She took a sip of the tea, letting the question settle in her mind before answering. Because pressing charges wouldn't have changed him, she said finally. It wouldn't have made him less of who he already is. But today changed something. Maybe not for him, but for the people who saw it. For the people who recorded it. For the kids who watched me stand my ground and realized they don't have to shrink either. Ray considered her words, nodding slowly. That's a lot of weight to carry, girl. She smiled faintly. I've carried worse. A beat of silence passed between them, comfortable and familiar. Then Ray set his bottle down on the counter, shaking his head with a chuckle. You really are your father's daughter. Imani glanced at the old photo of her father in uniform, his strong posture mirroring her own. Yeah, she murmured. I guess I am. She had spent so much time proving herself in spaces where people doubted her, in places where she had to fight for respect before she even spoke. But here, in this house, in this neighborhood, she didn't need to prove a damn thing. She was home. And whether she stayed or not, one thing was certain. She belonged. Standing tall, moving forward. The night settled over Baton Rouge like a heavy blanket, thick with humidity, and the low hum of cicadas echoing through the streets. The quiet wasn't absolute. Somewhere in the distance, a car's bass rattled against the pavement, and the occasional murmur of voices carried on the warm breeze. But for the most part, the city was winding down, folding itself into the rhythm of nightfall. Imani sat on the worn wooden steps of her father's house, a cold bottle of iced tea in her hand, condensation gathering against her fingers. She wasn't thinking about the confrontation from earlier, not exactly. She wasn't thinking about Officer Simmons, or the way he had underestimated her, or how he had been stripped of his authority right there on that street. No, she was thinking about what came after. What always came after. She had spent her life training for conflict, preparing for moments of high intensity where every decision mattered, where a second too slow or a step in the wrong direction could mean the difference between life and death. But what she had never fully prepared for, what no amount of combat training could teach her, was how to navigate the kind of fight that never truly ended. The fight for respect. The fight to be seen for who she was, not just the assumptions others made of her. Uncle Ray sat beside her, his own bottle resting against his knee. He didn't speak for a long time, simply watching the neighborhood settle into its familiar rhythm. He was good at that, sitting in silence, letting moments stretch without feeling the need to fill them with unnecessary words. It was something she had always appreciated about him. Finally, he let out a breath. So, he said, his voice low, thoughtful. What's next? Imani took a slow sip of her drink, considering the question. She had spent so long moving forward, always looking for the next mission, the next deployment, the next battle to fight. Now, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have a plan laid out in front of her. She glanced at Ray. I don't know. He chuckled, shaking his head. That's a first. She smirked. Yeah, it is. Another pause stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Then Ray shifted slightly, setting his bottle down on the step beside him. You know, he said, when your dad came back from his last tour, he struggled with that same question. Imani turned her head toward him, brows lifting slightly. What do you mean? Ray exhaled, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. He spent so much time being the soldier that when it was time to just be, he didn't know how. The world moves different when you're not constantly preparing for the next fight. And for some of us, he hesitated, his gaze distant for a moment. For some of us, that's harder than any battlefield. She understood what he was saying. It wasn't just about the military. It was about identity, about purpose. It was about stepping out of the role you had built for yourself and trying to figure out who you were without it. Did he ever figure it out? She asked. Ray gave a small, knowing smile. Took him a while. But yeah, he did. He glanced at her, his expression steady. And you will too. She wanted to believe that. She really did. But part of her wondered if she would always be waiting for the next moment of conflict, if she would always feel more at home in situations where her instincts had to be sharp, where she had to read people like enemy combatants instead of neighbors, coworkers, friends. She had come back to Baton Rouge looking for something. Maybe closure, maybe a sense of belonging. But she hadn't expected to find herself standing on a street corner, challenging the authority of a man who thought she didn't belong in her own neighborhood. That moment wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was simply necessary. And maybe that was the real lesson. Maybe it wasn't about searching for a fight. Maybe it was about knowing when to stand tall when one came to you. The sound of a car rolling to a slow stop in front of the house pulled her out of her thoughts. She and Ray both turned their heads toward the street, watching as a black sedan idled at the curb. The passenger side window rolled down, and Sergeant Burke leaned slightly toward them from the driver's seat. Ray let out a low whistle, didn't expect a house call. Imani pushed herself up, stepping down from the porch and walking toward the car. Burke watched her approach, his face unreadable in the dim streetlight glow. "Lieutenant," he greeted. "Sergeant," she replied evenly. Burke exhaled, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. "Figured you should know." Simmons put in his resignation. Imani's brows lifted slightly. That wasn't what she had expected. That was fast. Burke gave a half shrug. Man like him, he was never going to survive the scrutiny. Once word got out, once people started asking questions, he knew his days were numbered. He shook his head slightly. Didn't take long for him to realize he wasn't built for the heat. Imani considered that for a moment. Simmons had spent years believing he was untouchable, believing that his badge and his uniform made him untouchable. But the moment he faced consequences, real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist or an internal review that would quietly fade into the background, he crumbled. She wasn't surprised. But she also didn't care. Simmons was never the real problem. He was just a symptom of something bigger. The real fight wasn't just about men like him. It was about the system that allowed them to exist in the first place. Burke studied her expression, then nodded slightly, as if he understood exactly what she was thinking. "You did more than just handle yourself today, Carter. You made people see." He hesitated, then added, "And for what it's worth, I respect the hell out of that." Imani held his gaze, her lips pressing together in a thoughtful line. Then she gave a small nod. "Good." Burke chuckled softly. "Well, I'll leave you to it." He shifted the car into drive, then paused. "You ever think about going into law enforcement?" Imani let out a short laugh. "Not my style." Burke smirked. "Didn't think so." With that, he rolled up the window and drove off, leaving her standing in the street, the weight of the night still settling around her. She turned back toward the house, where Ray was watching her with an amused expression. "Law enforcement, huh?" he mused. She shook her head, stepping back up onto the porch. "Not a chance." Ray chuckled, nodding in approval. "Didn't think so." Imani leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. The day had been long, exhausting, eye-opening. But as she stood there, under the warm Louisiana sky, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. For once, she didn't feel like she had to prove herself. She didn't feel like she had to fight for recognition, or authority, or space. She didn't feel like she was walking through a world that constantly questioned her right to exist in it. For once, she just was. And that was enough.